Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Good Monday morning to you. Some of you are panicked. Christmas is almost upon us. You do not know what to get for your mother or your father or your sister or your brother. Here is my double-barreled suggestion. Go look up Heath Hardage Lee. Heath Hardage Lee. Her brand new book is The Mysterious Mrs Nixon. Her first book is The League of Wives. Both are excellent. She joins me now. Hello, Heath. Welcome back to the Hugh Hewitt Show. It's good to see you.
Hi, Hugh. Thanks so much for having me again.
Now, let's talk about first The League of Wives so that people will understand how you came to write about Pat Nixon. Would you give them the brief précis on The League of Wives and why that continues to sell and sell and sell?
Yes, that book has been very popular. So that book is about the courageous wives of American POWs and MIAs during the Vietnam War and the fight these women have with not only the North Vietnamese communists to get their husbands home, but the government of the US under Lyndon Johnson. It's only under President Nixon that these women finally get the support they need to bring their husbands home. So it is all about that fight and how courageous these military wives are.
I believe you were at the dedication of the memorial to them in Coronado. I think my daughter ran into you there. Certainly the last time I saw you, though, was at the Nixon Library when you were hard at work on The Mysterious Mrs Nixon, your brand new bestseller that the fetching Mrs. Hewitt just inhaled. Now, I got to tell you, there's new stuff in here for me. I did not know that the library staff and all of us had missed the collection of Pat and Dick letters from the war years. How did you find out about those?
Yes, those letters to you are incredible. And it changes, I think, the media perception of the Nixon marriage that has been for years, this loveless marriage. So untrue. President Nixon is smitten with Pat, like just devoted to her and she to him. But those letters, which Trisha and Julie, the Nixon daughters, kindly allowed me to see, these new letters show us this whole side of Richard Nixon, the smitten schoolboy almost. He just loves Pat, adores her. And she puts him off for a while. They meet, and he says within one meeting, he's going to marry her. She thinks he's nuts. And she makes him work pretty hard to win her hand. So I think those letters are such a window into that relationship. And they also go on during World War II. And they're just very passionate, it shows the couple as a very close knit, very supportive couple of each other and each other's goals as well.
Heath, do you feel as a biographer that you're working on something that's going to be missing for future historians? The written word. Letters don't exist anymore. It's all email. And I don't know that there's ever going to be a trove of letters like that available to a new biographer like you. Does that ever cross your mind that this whole business is changing?
Oh, completely, Hugh. We all worry about that, plus AI, taking over. But I don't think, I mean, AI is never going to take over what a human can do. The interpretation of emotions, that can only do basic facts, put it together. So I don't think AI is going to replace us. But your point about letters, yes, things like this, it's going to be difficult going forward. However, there are so many lives in the past to be discovered, and they are all, or if you're lucky, like I was, there are wonderful places like the Nixon Library that have these archives full of these documents, which we would now maybe call artifacts. They are artifacts of a different age. So I still think there are so many subjects of the past that are going to have documents and letters. As a biographer, I doubt in my lifetime I'm going to run out of those subjects.
Now, I am not a neutral person when it comes to Mrs. Nixon. She was very nice to me when I was very young and in San Clemente, making sure that the kid who had just arrived had a place to go for Thanksgiving and that kind of thing. So I've always had the highest esteem for her. I am really surprised. I'm still surprised that the Nixon daughters said, "Come on in, Heath Hardage Lee." Was that because of the wives' book?
Well, that is a good point, and I would not have blamed Julie and Tricia if they never wanted to talk to anyone from the journalism world again after the treatment they've all had over the years from the media. I think my book, The League of Wives, because I found in that book, and I try to not take sides in my book. I'm a very unbiased biographer, but you've got to write what you find. And in The League of Wives, I found that Lyndon Johnson was guilty of not helping the POW wives, of being obstructive, of not caring about the POW MI contingent at all, or the women trying to get them out. While President Nixon, while the women had gone public on their own about the problem, he gave them support, he gave them a bigger platform. And let's not forget, he ended the Vietnam War. So I do
Yeah,
think that matters for that.
I'm coming right back with Heath Lee. Don't go anywhere except to Amazon. Here's the book if you're watching on the Salem News Channel, The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon. I've got a few more questions for Heath. I am back now with Heath Hardage Lee, and if you're watching on YouTube, this is the book, The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon. The one person of all people who ought to read it, Heath, is Usha Vance, because she's 38 years old. She's just about to become the second lady of the United States. Same, Mrs. Nixon was 41 when she became the second lady of the United States. She had young children, like Mrs. Vance have young children. Do you think there are lessons there for her?
Oh, absolutely. That's such a good call. She definitely should read it. Yes, and I think in both cases, these women are very committed to their families, and they're going to both be pulled different ways. There's the political life and the family life, and that's one of the central conflicts, I think, in Mrs. Nixon's life, is leaving her two little girls to go on the campaign trail, to travel globally around the world, to do her patriotic duty as second lady. So I think there are lessons there in that work-life balance, as we would call it now, and also in diplomacy and how you must have this global embrace of other countries. So I think Mrs. Vance would do well to read the book.
Yeah, the 1953 trip that Ike sends a young Richard Nixon on, he also sends a young Mrs. Nixon on. They can't take the girls with them, obviously. Did you find it amazing that she made it through, I don't know, 21 countries in 53 days on 4 dresses?
Oh my goodness, yes. And the packing alone, her suitcase is so tiny, which they have at the Nixon Museum. I cannot imagine I would ever be able to do that, but she was very efficient. She was so prepared. The staff would go to her for advice, information, because she read every word of the State Department briefing books. Amazing. She was an amazing diplomat. And President Eisenhower, I call in the book the talent scout, who finds Mrs. Nixon, who sees how good she is with diplomacy, and tells Richard Nixon, quote, take Pat on all these global trips they go on.
Now, she does. There's an extraordinary part of the Nixon Library where the trips of Mrs. Nixon are recounted. She went everywhere, and when she went somewhere, she didn't go to the state dinners. She went to the schools, the orphanages, the poorest of the poor. It was sort of a departure from first ladies prior and a bridge to first ladies thereafter. Is that your conclusion?
Oh, absolutely. She only wanted to be where she would be useful. And I think that's one of the key words with her, is being useful. And also, she said after that 1953 trip we just talked about, everywhere I went, it helped women. Her goal was to lift up women and children, which, by the way, is also Mrs. Trump, one of her big initiatives. That is what they both want to do. And I think Mrs. Trump should definitely read this book too and take a page there, because everywhere Mrs. Nixon went, and throughout her career as second lady and first lady, she was very progressive on women's issues, and people don't give her credit for that.
I also like to point out Richard Nixon is the only American who's been on 5 national tickets besides FDR, but that forgets that Eleanor Roosevelt and Pat Nixon were also on 5 national tickets, and that meant that they had to do 5 presidential campaigns. I can't imagine doing one, Heath. Can you? I mean, it's just such a grind.
It's so grueling, and I will tell you, Hugh, during this book, I kept saying, you start talking to the people in your book, and I said, Mrs. Nixon, please take a nap. I mean, I was worried about her. She, it's such a grueling process. As you said, 5 of these. But another one of her famous quotes is, I do or die. I never cancel. And she never did. Such an amazing person with her stamina, her energy, and just her fortitude too in the face of all these political battles her husband went through.
She's also the original mover of the letter that Richard Nixon sent to Donald Trump, because it was Mrs. Nixon who saw Donald Trump on the Donahue show and told RN he's going to be president. It was a letter we had on display at the library for a long time, probably be back out during the second Trump term. Let me finish this way, Heath. You spend years writing a biography. What is the most surprising thing that you learned about Mrs. Nixon?
Well, Mrs. Nixon, the most surprising thing after 4 years of working on her, because that is the least she deserves, to see everything, to learn everything about her. I think the most important thing I learned about her is she is the opposite of how the media portrayed her. They portrayed her as mysterious, aloof, not interested in politics or any of this. This is simply not true. She was warm. She was one of our hardest working first ladies, I think, a global diplomat, progressive on women, supportive of her husband throughout. So she gets so little credit for what she did also in the White House to bring in more art and objects than any first lady before or since. There's so many things about her.
You just reminded me. One of the things I learned is I did not know that the look of the White House today owes so much to her work with Conger and the Williamsburg Foundation. I didn't know any of that.
Absolutely. We always think about Mrs. Kennedy, who did a wonderful thing by starting this, but Mrs. Nixon is the one who did the most, and the look today is all the Nixon era.
So let me close with this, Heath. How is the book selling in a Christmas season where people need to find a Christmas? It's the perfect present for young women, middle-aged women, old women, and anyone who likes American history, because you get a different view of RN and his pivotal presidency by seeing it through the prism of Mrs. Nixon.
Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate the kind words. And of course it is selling, but it can always sell better. So Christmas is the perfect time to purchase this. And I think also in the lead up to the inauguration of our new president, this is the perfect book for people to read who want to learn about first ladies and their role, and how important this role is, and how to do this with grace and poise, as Mrs. Nixon shows us.
And I want to point out to people, Amazon will usually give you a discount if you buy 2 books. And Heath Lee's first book, The League of Wives, deserves to be on every shelf, because it's about what it's like to be a military spouse. Perhaps the best book ever written about being a military spouse is The League of Wives, and The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, now on the bookshelf. What do you turn to next, Heath?
Wow. Well, that is a great question. I am hoping to do Tom Wolfe's biography next, the great writer, the man in the white suit, who I enjoy sort of his cloaked conservatism, which you don't really notice with that white suit, but he is a closet conservative.
The Bonfire of the Vanities, one of the most significant books of the last century, and the characters in that book, especially the Irish-American defense lawyer who explains the favor bank, I still tell people about that. That would be quite a daunting task, Heath. I mean, that would be overwhelming.
It's a lot. Well, I'm a native Richmonder. I've interviewed Mr. Wolfe several times. He's also from Richmond. So it is overwhelming, but Hugh, all these books are overwhelming when you start. So you just have to do one document at a time, one interview at a time, and give yourself 4 years. That's
where do you find the Wolfe papers? Where are they collected?
They're actually all in New York at the New York Public Library. So, I'm hoping if I can get the family on board, because I always like to have the family involved. I would spend a lot of time in New York. Yale has a lot of his papers also, and Washington and Lee, which is right down the road from where I live. So, I
Wow.
think it's a possible thing. We'll see. We'll have to see if everyone is on board with this. I'm working on it.
Well, back to the immediate. The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon is available in bookstores now. It's at Amazon.com. It is the perfect Christmas present. And get the League of Wives at the same time. Heath Hardage Lee, thank you for joining me. You have a very wonderful Christmas.
You too, Hugh. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
You bet.